Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Dirks, and on behalf of Choice and ACRL, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Meeting the Urgent Need for E-Resources for Remote and Hybrid Environments, which is sponsored by ProQuest. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from ACRL and Choice that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library community. For ED users, these structured 60-minute live presentations provide the opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I'd like to point out just a couple of features of the webinar software. First off, everyone joining today as an attendee is automatically muted and your cameras are disabled, so don't worry about generating noise or feedback during the program. We've got that taken care of for you. In the main area of the screen, you should be able to follow along with the presentation materials. We're also using the Q&A feature today, so if you have questions for either of our panelists, please drop them in there as they occur to you. We'll take some time at the end of the presentation to get to as many questions as we can. Often we have more questions than we can get to, so if we don't get to yours, we apologize in advance. It is simply a limitation imposed by time. We are also using Zoom's automated transcription system today during the webinar. To toggle that on or off, you can use the little CC button at the bottom of your screen. And also note that we are recording today's program, and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archived version of today's program. And with that, we are ready to get started. So I will turn things over to Barbara Olson from ProQuest.
Thanks, Mark. So welcome, everybody. I'm pleased that you were able to join us today. And as Mark mentioned, we're going to be talking about meeting this urgent need for e-resources. I am going to turn my camera off because I've had a few issues with restarts today, so I don't want to have any issues while I'm presenting. So I am going to turn my camera off, but hopefully you can all hear me okay. All right, so let's be able to advance the slides. Okay, there we go. There we go. So with remote and hybrid teaching and the need to reclaim library space, digital content continues to be more essential than ever. Faculty are increasingly relying on electronic versions of historical and current periodicals and newspapers, along with all kinds of other content like ebooks, streaming video, digital music scores, and course reserves to enhance learning and support research. So let me introduce myself, and then I'll also introduce our guest speaker today. So I am Barb Olson. I am the Director of Product Marketing at ProQuest. I'm responsible for our primary sources and historical collections, and I'm joined today by Jesse Silva, who is a federal government information librarian at UC Berkeley. Jesse's going to talk about the unique process that his institution went through when they were trying to match newspapers and microfilm to e-versions, helping his library acquire more crucial e-resources on a limited budget. They also saved thousands of feet of shelf space to make room for social distancing. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about our eNow program and how it's changing over time, starting with our title matching process. I'll explain to you what it is and how it can help you, particularly if you're thinking about a space reclamation project, either to meet social distancing requirements, or if you are or were in the stages of a library space conversion project, maybe to reimagine your library into meeting space or maker spaces, but having a lot fewer physical materials in the building itself. Then I'm going to talk specifically about primary source materials, particularly periodicals, newspapers, and government documents that you may have on your shelves that can be considered for digital conversion. And I'll finish with an overview of how we can support you with evolving e-resource needs with complementary print to electronic title matching. So now let me introduce Jesse. So Jesse focuses on scholarly resources strategy and is, as I mentioned, a federal government documents librarian at UC Berkeley. He has over 20 years of experience working in the academic libraries. While much of his career has focused on government information, over the last few years, he has realized a greater interest in collections in general, particularly in issues around shared print and developing strategies for increasing diversity within library collections. Jesse holds a BA in Community Studies from UC Santa Cruz and an MLIS from San Jose State University. Jesse, over to you.
Thank you, Barb. And thank you all for attending today. I'm going to have my camera off and move this. Here we go. We'll start this. Sorry about that. I'm going to have my camera off. I've been having a bit of connectivity issues today, so my camera will be off. Apologies for that. I'm looking forward to sharing a bit about the convergence of a number of factors and processes we took at Berkeley to increase digital access and replace a lot of microfilm during a time of such social upheaval due to COVID. Though I must admit that some of the planning I'm going to describe took place well before COVID. I want to quickly thank a few people who worked on this process that I'm going to describe. Joanne New Ramirez, our AUL for Scholarly Resources, Jennifer Dorner, our history librarian, Paul Lynch, the head of our newspaper microfilms library, and Mark Hemhauser, the head of our acquisitions. Also want to thank the subject area division heads at Berkeley, Susan Edwards, Shannon Keeley, Brian Quigley, and Abby Scheel. So the story I'm about to tell begins in the before times with the James K. Moffett Library. Before times meaning before COVID. The Moffett Library is in the middle of a two-phased renovation. Phase one of its renovation was completed in 2016. Before and after phase one, the library was planning and fundraising for the second phase to build what we are calling the Center for Connected Learning, a space where students will have a really immersive educational experience. They will be able to move between multimedia classrooms, collaborative project spaces, hands-on studios, as well as have access to both peer-to-peer and expert consultation for their research and projects. You may notice I've put a date in the lower right corner of this and the following slides, and this is to illustrate the timeline this process took from about 2016-ish to today. Phase two of the Moffett renovation was planned and fundraising was in full swing prior to 2019. What you're looking at is a cross-section of what Moffett will look like after its second renovation to build the Center for Connected Learning. You'll notice a couple white stars on the image. The space between the two stars is currently a behind-the-scenes library staff workspace that houses acquisitions, metadata services, the library's mailroom, and other departments in an area of about 100,000 square feet. Since the Moffett renovation would take over this staff space and convert it into more of a student use space, the staff who currently work in this area of the building would need to be permanently relocated to another part of campus prior to the start of construction. But where would they go? The decision was made to move the staff to various locations within the Doe Library. The Doe Library is the largest library on campus and houses the administrative offices, as well as many of the library's central services and a couple of academic departments. You can also see Moffett in the lower right corner of the image, so the move isn't all that far from where the current location is. The newspaper and microforms library in the lower level of Doe is one location some of the staff will be moving to. While the space itself is 8,900 square feet, it will not be used entirely for staff as we have microfilm and microfiche collections our users will still need to access. In order to accommodate the new staff workspaces, we need to remove a number of microfilm and their cabinets, some 50,000 reels of microfilm in total. We would also need to remove a shelving area housing print newspapers, along with a number of other print indexes before we can begin to renovate the space. So we started a process of looking at our microfilm holdings. We contacted a number of vendors, including ProQuest, to see what archival collections we had purchased that could be replaced with online versions. We also compared this with the holdings information found in our catalog, and the result was a very messy spreadsheet. If you're going to do this type of work, be prepared to do some data cleaning, especially if you're merging data from a number of sources and vendors. We found that tools like OpenRefine can only help do a partial cleanup. Some of the issues we ran into had to do with our cataloging. Vendors often sold their microform titles in parts, and our records did not always reflect which parts we had. Other issues stemmed from historical errors in the data. Some of our microfilm collections date back to the 1960s and 70s. This led us to finding issues like smaller vendors getting absorbed into larger vendors, and again into larger vendors, and sometimes again into even larger vendors. And our local information didn't always easily match up with the vendor provided data, not just ProQuest, but from others as well. Messy data leads to messy results, and we spent a lot of time trying to resolve this. As you can imagine, with any microfilm to digital conversion, we also had to work out a budget to acquire titles we were going to convert. This was a long, complex, and complicated process, and towards the end of 2019, we only had about 20,000 reels of microfilm identified, far from the estimated 50,000 we needed. When the process started, we were only looking at archival microfilm collections. That was the focus we had. So we switched gears a bit toward the end of 2019 and started looking at newspaper titles. We had many long runs of newspapers on microfilm and we could replace with digital access. There were a number of added bonuses to this as well. Newspapers could be used by multiple disciplines. Digital access allowed full text searching instead of relying on print indexes. Digital access was also more accessible via screen readers and could be accessed via the internet by our user community no matter where in the world they may be. All these reasons and more contributed to this replacement being thought of as a strategic investment. And who really wants to look at newspapers on microfilm? So to identify the longest runs of newspapers we had, the head of newspapers and microforms and I developed a complicated process. We took a walk through the collection and visually saw which newspapers filled the most cabinets. Really complicated. Once those titles were identified, we asked questions like, what did we already own digitally with perpetual access? It had been a while since the last time the library really looked into newspaper titles to acquire digitally. What was now available that we could acquire with perpetual access? Including newspapers proved advantageous, and in a couple months, we quickly reached our goal of 50,000 potential reels that we could remove. By early March 2020, we were starting to look into 7 to 8 newspaper titles we needed to purchase, and we all know what happened in March. COVID-19 threw a big wrench into this process. Like many of you, our acquisitions of physical materials stopped in March, and we were not able to resume the ordering of physical materials until August. We tried to pivot as much as we could, and we are thankful to all the vendors and information providers who voluntarily opened up their e-collections for our users to access in support of the new environment of distance teaching and learning. Even with all this increased access, though, classes were still going on, professors were still doing research, students and researchers still needed access to materials for their work that were not open. So the library made the decision to preference electronic ordering when it was available. But as we all know, not every resource needed by researchers is available electronically. In addition to this, part of our annual process is to acquire some information resources at the end of each fiscal year with unspent collection funds. Because ordering ground almost to a halt during this time, there was extra collections money on the table to be spent. Not a lot, but more than we usually anticipate for end-of-year purchasing. This opened the door for us to acquire more resources to not only support the microfilm conversion, but also to support other subject areas of the collection as well. So we combine these two processes. Collection managers were asked to quickly work with their selector librarians and propose titles that would replace microfilmed and or expand access to primary source collections and could be used by more than one discipline. Greater access to digital primary source collections was also asked for by a number of faculty in a recent survey as well. These titles also had to be from vendors we had existing license agreements with. We were not going to start new license negotiations when the fiscal year ended June 30th, and we were already in April, the end of April, actually. Librarians went through their desiderata lists, wish lists, and proposed a number of titles that fit these criteria. We also looked at titles that were not acquired during our earlier process to evaluate and acquire needed resources. There were a lot of Zoom meetings during this time. Collection managers went through the lists and decided on 35 resources to be purchased from 6 different vendors. And you can see the list of vendors on this slide. Of the 35, we acquired 3 collections that contain some 20 newspapers, including titles we didn't own, but would be of great use to our user community. A couple ebook collections, some electronic archives, digital music scores, and we also provided for a one-time increase in our deposit account with Overdrive, which we felt was important given the pandemic's limiting access to some needed materials. This acquisition process allowed us to increase our digital holdings for a number of disciplines and will allow us to move forward with the original project to replace microfilm with digital access. And if you're curious about the original microfilm project, it's still ongoing. In the summer and fall of 2020, we came up with criteria for a select number of titles that we would continue to preserve the physical copies by sending them to offsite storage, since we could not send everything. The criteria consisted of titles having to do with the San Francisco Bay Area or California-based titles, like some newspapers listed here. We felt these titles would not be preserved nationally, and there is a huge local interest in newspapers for various projects, so therefore we decided to retain the physical microfilm copy. We also wanted to preserve titles pertaining to diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and justice, because we thought many of these types of titles have historically been excluded from long-term preservation, and we wanted to start correcting some of that. These titles were sent to storage in February. We're also going to recycle some microfilm titles, and here are some numbers. Of the 22 newspaper titles that we were going to remove, 6 will be going to storage. This has been moved. They've already been moved to storage and are in process. Of the 54 microfilm collections, 14 will be going to storage. And if you're curious about the number of what this looks like physically, it's about 33,000 reels, which is equivalent of about 65,458 cubic feet, or almost 14,000 pounds. And that's the story I have to tell you today. And with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Barb. Thank you.
Thanks, Jesse. That was a great story. Thanks for sharing it. I'm stuck on the 100,000 square feet of staff space going down to 8,900. So but good luck with the project. And I'm glad that you were able to see this through to end.
Thank you.
Yeah. So
yeah, they're not just going down to 8,900. They're going to go throughout the whole building.
Oh, okay. It's like,
that's just
wow.
one space.
How are you going to do that exactly? So, okay. So I want to talk to you a little bit more now about this title matching process that Jesse has told you a little bit about how they were using it, kind of what it is, and some other ways in which you can think about using it for yourself. So it really is a pretty basic process in terms of just matching, in the books case, ISBN numbers, and in periodicals, it's ISSN numbers, against your title list to see what you have in print form and what we may have in our digital collections. And it's really a great way to do, the kinds of projects that Jesse talked about, was the space reclamation, reimagining your library, but it also is great for identifying gaps in your collection. And so when you couple that report with something that we call a curriculum analysis, which is exactly what it sounds like, we look at all of the courses that you offer at your institution and then map it to the content that you have in your library to support those courses, either from a teaching perspective or from the student's ability to complete assignments. You can really start to get some great insights now about some collection development strategies. So what's great about these reports is they're all free and they're done by us, and we put them in nice little PowerPoints, and your account manager sits down and has a conversation with you about what we can do to might help you with some of the projects you've got going on in your library. So from a books perspective, this is kind of where the title matching really started, was with books several years ago. We did a lot of these projects in Australia, but it does more than just identify your gaps and things. So now the reports actually help you identify some titles that might be on special pricing. So it would say, oh, all these titles might be on offer right now for up to 50% off. So then you can see what additional great savings that you can have in your projects. But also it's starting to identify other kinds of things about these titles, like maybe they're award winners, or this particular title is heavily used in your library, or this particular title would be great for some of your special initiatives around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So lots of great insight that you can glean from these reports. So let's talk a little bit more about historical periodicals and newspapers and government documents, and how and why we wanted to include these different kinds of primary source content types into our eNow program. So specifically around periodicals, this is an example of what a TMF report would look like when we've matched ISSN numbers against your title list. So for instance, a particular library has 63 titles that map into our Periodicals Archive Online Collection 1. So that's great news. It also tells you that you can save, over 1,000 feet of shelf space, even better news. But even better yet, if you would buy this collection digitally, you're actually going to get 217 titles instead of just the 63 you have. So it really allows you to start building very robust collections, probably more than you might have in physical form, but you get a really robust, comprehensive collection digitally. So another aspect of these title matching reports is that you can, if you're interested, looking at your peers, if you compare yourself to some other peer organizations or institutions, what kinds of materials are they starting to convert from print to digital? So, and it might give you a little bit of insight down the road, and as something we want to talk about at the end of the session today about how we might want to share, or how you can think about sharing your materials through Rapid ILL, so through an interlibrary loan. But we'll get into that a little bit more at the end of the session today. So as I mentioned, we're growing our eNow program. And as I said, the eNow program really started out as a matching for space reclamation projects, but it's through COVID and pandemic and this immediate shift to a virtual classroom, digital learning, online learning, we needed to make more content types available just sheerly from an access standpoint. So government documents certainly offer themselves into this program for a couple of reasons. Certainly shelf space. Government documents take a ton of shelf space, as you well know if you have any in your library. Although we can't match them because they have their own unique numbering system through a SUDOC system. We can't really do a match like we do with books and periodicals, but certainly you would know if you've got hearings or congressional record or the CRDC, the CRS reports, how much space those take. Plus the fact that libraries are closed, so federal depository libraries, which have to have government content made available to the people, weren't able to do that. So we were giving access to some of those government documents for free during COVID because those federal depository libraries have an obligation to make that content available to the public. But also archival materials. So we're hearing from faculty, hey, don't forget about us. We still want to do our research. Yes, we have to teach in a digital environment, but we still want to be able to do our research, and we can't make research trips right now. There's no archives open, special collection doors are closed. So we wanted to put some archival materials into the program as well. And then you even heard Jesse mention, the digital music scores that they access. And we found some interesting content types that became instantly popular and in high demand when everything changed for us last March. And then, as I mentioned, I want to talk a little bit about this whole idea of resource sharing and the interlibrary loan. So talking more about periodicals, we did some research a couple of years ago, 2017, I guess it's a few years ago now, where we actually were asking faculty about what kinds of content types do they use in their research and what do they use in their teaching and why might those be different. And they told us that periodicals were at the top 10 on their list of the materials that they use both in their research and their teaching. Of course, primary sources are used heavily by faculty because they want their students to develop those critical thinking skills, as you've heard us talk about many times. But periodicals take up a ton of space, as we've been talking about. So these lend themselves really well to this whole idea of this conversion, but also they're very multidisciplinary in nature. So our collections in particular cover over 350 different subjects and topics. So very multidisciplinary, can be used across the curriculum. And our collections are huge. So we've got over 30 million pages of periodicals content that include journals and magazine back files and over 3 centuries of scholarship. So typically periodicals are going to cover your arts and humanities, social sciences, in which they certainly do. But we're also starting to digitize other kinds of collections for emerging areas of research. So masculinity studies, gender, LGBTQ, entertainment, health and fitness, human rights and social justice. and this big initiative that everybody's calling DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So periodicals really do lend themselves well to both research and teaching. But on the research front, so our product manager, Chris Cotton, really wanted to start digging a little bit deeper into the research value of periodicals and decided to do an analysis looking at our dissertations database, but also the scholarly articles that are on our platform. And he looked at a 10-year period between 2008 and 2018 and found over 260,000 dissertations and articles that were citing periodicals. So if you put this into context, so in that same time period, over 900,000 dissertations were published during that time. So 14% might not seem like a very big number in terms of those dissertations that are using periodicals in the research. They're citing them there, but we didn't look at every single periodical we have. We only looked at a very small handful of periodicals. So the number really is understated in terms of how much it's being used in scholarly research. And as I mentioned, so multidisciplinary, it can be used in all kinds of dissertations, not just arts and humanities dissertations, but certainly in medicine, sci-tech, the arts and humanities for sure, but all kind of business research. So we were seeing all kinds of dissertations across the curriculum in terms of how they were using periodicals. And here's an example of some of the findings. So Periodicals Archive Online is a collection, 10 different collections of over 700 different titles. But in this particular analysis, Chris only looked at the top 10 titles. And comparing those top 10 titles, they were cited over 2.3 times more often than the New York Times. So if you think about that, the New York Times is a newspaper of record for the United States, certainly considered a global title, but periodicals are being used more often in scholarly research during that time period than the New York Times. Even further, Education Magazine Archive, which is a collection of 26 different titles, was being used more often than the Washington Post and the Guardian and the Observer. And News Policy and Politics Magazine Archive, which includes the Newsweek title, was being used more often than the Wall Street Journal. So it really does go to show that these periodicals are so heavily used in research, but also in research and teaching. So they're a great resource to have in your library from a digital standpoint. So we just look at periodicals in general. Just PAO alone offers over 2 miles worth of shelf savings in terms of the space that it takes up. And as I mentioned, the PAO is being used more than the New York Times. We've got thousands of multidisciplinary titles and a growing collection of specialty titles as well. Subjects, over 400. It's a top 10 resource type from a faculty standpoint in terms of what they're using in their research and what they're doing in their teaching, but also in these emerging areas of research. So there's lots of new areas coming out, but there's not a lot of content. So Chris again looked at some dissertations that were written last year. There were over 900 dissertations written on masculinity studies last year. But he looked back at what resources were available for that. There's only 40 scholarly publications. So that's why you're going to see us start to digitize materials like the GQ archive, men's magazines, health and fitness, because there's no content there. So we really want to be able to keep our finger on the pulse of those emerging areas of research and make sure that we're making those digital collections available to all of you to support your faculty and your students. Some of the other content types that I've mentioned that we are including in this program certainly are newspapers. You heard me compare newspapers to periodicals, but it's not to say that newspapers aren't an important content type, because we all know how important they actually are. They're used by all levels of researchers as a great place for younger researchers to start. But again, this is another area of research that we did on ourselves. So we asked Dr. Eric Meyer, who is now the Dean at the School of Information at UT Austin, and he was at the Oxford Institute for a while. And while he was there, we asked him to look at some of our newspapers, and he likes to dig around in our dissertations database. So he did a citations analysis on 5 specific newspapers and wanted to see how those newspapers were being used in scholarly output. And what we found were some pretty interesting things there, that certain titles are known for certain kinds of areas of research. So the Washington Post, for instance, you would definitely look for politics, economics, policy, that kind of thing. But what we found when we started looking at what sorts of dissertations were being written where they cited the Washington Post went way beyond those topics into medical research, sci-tech, business, all kinds of other topics. So that title is being used outside of what you would normally expect it to be used for. but also we could see by looking at a heat map of the world that it was being used all around the globe. And we found this to be true of all the titles that we looked at. So newspapers certainly are a very important content type to be considered when you're thinking about maybe you want to take some microfilm or take some physical copies off your shelf, or you just want to be able to give your end users access to more digital content. So in the case of title matching, we were able to actually match ISSN numbers of certain titles where we could find ISSN numbers on them. And as that title changed over time, we could actually identify 28 different titles that we could put into this eNow program. So we can do some title matching on newspaper titles now. Government documents, as I mentioned, we can't do that sort of matching, but certainly we know how many shelves of linear feet, these government documents take. And plus, the US and the UK government study everything. There isn't a topic that they don't study. So there's all these research reports that are available that are written by experts for the congressmen as they're studying a topic so they can debate about it, vote on it, create laws around it. And these research reports are written in everyday language. They're great resources, multidisciplinary resources for your students to have access to, again, all digitally. In fact, the US government buys back their content from us because we've kept a better collection, a more comprehensive collection of all the documents that were generated by the US government than they've kept themselves. So it's a great multidisciplinary resource as well. And then these archival collections, as I mentioned, faculty still want to do their research. So we wanted to put some of these archival collections into the program. So our primary sources, I just want to take a minute to talk about them because we've created some programs around our primary sources. We put together packages of different levels of however many products you might want to have in your institution. Maybe you want everything that we have. Maybe you want to pick and choose 50 products that you want for yourself based on your curriculum, or maybe your faculty are writing a book, or you're offering some new courses in some areas and you need some access to some new primary sources. But we have hundreds of millions of pages of content that cover 6 centuries. We've got over 170 newspaper titles, adding another 30 soon, lots of, hundreds of years of periodicals coverage. But there's also some statistics on this infographic that show how important primary sources are, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, but 98% of faculty are using primary sources because I think it's really important for their students to use them to develop those critical thinking skills that are going to help them once they graduate from college and they get out into the world. We also, cite statistics about how often these content types are being used in scholarly research, and they're in the top 10 resource types that faculty are requiring or requesting from you to make sure that they're available in your library. So lots of really good, data points here to prove the value of primary sources. So what we saw during some of the, the pandemic, and we continue to see, is some interesting content types that were requested by all of you. And digital music scores was one of them. So, faculty and students can't get to live performances, but faculty still need to teach, music theory, music history, the whole idea of conducting and performance. And students were able to continue to get everything they needed out of those courses, primarily because these musical scores were available digitally. So we've got 53,000 titles, over 4,600 different composers. So this became really important content type last year as things were changing for everyone in terms of how we were going to deliver higher education. Same thing is true for video. I mean, that became a go-to resource. It was easy to embed for faculty into a digital learning plan, lesson plan, over 70,000 different videos across the curriculum. So from anthropology to zoology, there was something there for every faculty in terms of getting access to video so they could continue doing their teaching. In this particular collection from the PBS, there's something actually unique about this one. So all of you who are familiar with aggregated databases, that titles come and go. You never really know when or how that's going to happen. It just becomes a rights issue, or publishers want to move their content around between different vendors, and it's aggravating to everyone when you're used to having a title and then you all of a sudden lose access. But in this particular collection, that's not an option. So there's a life of file rights in this collection. And of course, PBS is a great brand, so they've got Nova, Ken Burns series, Nature, Frontlines. They're really great titles in this collection, but a nice added value with regard to not losing rights to titles in the collection. So one of the other things I wanted to mention is that we looked at we were just given some results from a survey that Inside Higher Ed did, and they were surveying the chief academic officers in the US. And 3 out of 4 of those officers indicated that their institutions were going to continue to actually offer more hybrid and online courses than they did either before or during the pandemic. So we know that virtual learning is not going to go away. It's definitely here to stay. So having access to digital resources is going to be important, but also this idea of how you can share these resources amongst yourself if you don't necessarily have the budget to be able to convert all your print to digital. There's this tool called Rapid ILL where you can actually do some sharing of resources. So, we talked about this whole transition to E, but your library's patrons are expecting more from you. So they want access to a variety of resources, as we've talked about today. They want faster service, they want more tools, and they want all this stuff, but you've got the same budget that you have to work with. So over the past year, we've heard this, this concept of community borrowing and lending has taken a more prominent role and has become part of every discussion. So many more libraries are looking at it to see if it's going to be a tool that they can use to expand their collection coverage across a variety of resource types, especially during these budget times. So we've seen interest and witnessed substantial growth in this tool called Rapid ILL. So more than 480 libraries worldwide are using its technology today, and they're helping each other, be faster, more efficient, and more cost effective. So it's our hope that emerging services like Rapid ILL can help you fill gaps and fulfill your patrons' content needs, no matter what kind of content that they're looking for that you might not have in your special collection. So something to keep in mind, as we're thinking about this whole access for virtual learning and this whole need to convert your print collections to digital. So that's what we have for you today. So I thank you for your time and attention. And Mark, I'm going to ask you to look through the Q&A, if you wouldn't mind, to see if there's any questions in there that Jesse and I might be able to answer for our attendees today.
Excellent. So we've had a few things in the Q&A, and I would encourage folks, if you're listening in out there, if you have additional questions for either Barbara or for Jesse, please go ahead and drop those in there. As I said, we'll do as many as we can get to. One that came up just a second ago was a question about whether the presentation will be available later. And I would just say that, yes, we are recording the session today, and that everybody who signed up should receive a link to that recording. I'll just give folks a second or two there to drop some more questions in. So we have a question here from Brianna. And Brianna says, what is the process for the curriculum needs analysis? Can you talk about that a little bit, Barbara?
Sure, yeah. So you would just reach out to your account manager or your sales specialist if you have one, and just ask them to just let them know that you want to do a curriculum analysis, and we're happy to run the report for you. And it's a really nice report in terms of, it looks at all the different courses and what you have in your library now, and then some of the other products that we have in our collections that might be useful for application. And we also do a lookup on the different faculty that teach that course. So then you can go directly to that faculty and say, hey, I see you're teaching a course on this. There's this great collection that's out there. Maybe you can take a trial of the collection and see how you can use it in your classroom. Or so it really does give you a lot of really powerful information in terms of what you have in your collections, how does it support the courses that are being offered, and then what other kinds of opportunities might there be for other collections for you to consider.
Great. And a sort of follow-up question to that one is that Brianna also asks, is that free? Does it cost anything for a library?
Oh, no. Absolutely free, 100% free. So the title matching report, the curriculum analysis, the benchmarking, all of that is done for free, because we really want to, partner with you to make sure that you we've got a great strategy laid out for you in terms of some collection development or acquisition
Excellent.
strategies.
Great, great. We've got some more questions coming in here. Let's see, we've got one here from Marilou, who asks, what about old newspapers that don't have an ISSN and cease publication or no title change, so there was no succeeding title with an ISSN? Can you match those, or how is that dealt with?
Yeah, it's a manual process though. We can do it. We just want a title list, you know, of all the titles that you have, and then we can compare it to the title list we have. Because we, like I mentioned, we have 170 historical newspaper titles. I'm going to add another 30. So it's not a huge undertaking, but it is a manual process, and we're happy to do that.
Excellent. So we have a question here from Lynn that came in. And Lynn asks, can you explain a little bit more about how Rapid ILL works? And before I throw that over to you, Barbara, I would just mention, I think it may have been actually the very last webinar that we did was about Leganto and Rapid ILL. So if you go to our website, you can find a video that talks a lot about Rapid ILL. So could you talk a little bit about that, Barbara?
I will try. It's not my area. It's not my product area, but I will actually, Mark, if you can get contact information from this person, I can actually put them in touch with a product manager, not necessarily a salesperson, so they can talk a little bit more about what it is. But based on the description I was given, it's an article and book chapter resource sharing from print and electronic collections. So right now it looks like it's just looking at books, but they do, as I mentioned in the talking points that they gave to me, that it was thinking about all kinds of resource types, not just books. So it would be interesting to find out how they are sharing those resources. So it seems to me like if someone has something that someone's looking for, there's some sort of a community ability to communicate with each other and say, hey, I've got that, and here's how, and I'll share it with you. But exactly how it works, I'm not exactly sure, but we can find out for you and get some more specifics around that.
Sure. And we'll definitely put that person in touch so that they can learn a little more. And as I mentioned, I'll send them the link to the webinar that we did, so that if they're interested.
Thank you.
We've got, let's see, a few more questions coming in here. So we've got a question here from Catherine that came through, and Catherine says, you mentioned title matching. For example, say there were 63 titles, but you often offer collections with even more titles.
Right.
But doesn't that mean that the library ends up spending more for content that they may not need? Can small libraries with small budgets afford these collections?
Yeah, because our pricing goes by the different markets. So it's our pricing is set by FTE and the type of institution that you're in. So actually, it really does become pretty cost effective to be able to convert those titles, and depending on how many titles you have that match and what that delta is between the collection helps also to drive the price. So we don't want you to have to pay for something you've already paid for once. But the idea is that you get more than you had before, and plus you get it in digital form, so you can make it available to your customers, 24/7, 365. And we saw how frequently periodicals are used both in teaching but also in research. So hopefully the value is there just in being able to get digital access.
Excellent, excellent. We've got a question here for you, Jesse, and sort of a question about the microfilm that you were moving around. So did you retain any of the US Census microfilm that you have? Do you know about that?
Yes, so this project was only looking at commercially produced microfilm. We did not look at any of our government microfilm. And the US microfilm that we do, the US census microfilm that we do have is very limited to like certain areas around the Bay Area. So we weren't going to remove, I don't think we plan to remove those because they're so locally focused.
That makes sense. All right. We've got another question here from Cheryl that asks, and I think this is for you, Barbara, as well. What's the turnaround time for a title matching report? Does it depend on the number of titles, or how long does that often take?
Yeah, it's not long. I think a couple of days. I'm not, it just depends, I guess, what's in their pipeline in terms of how many report requests they have. I know that they've done hundreds of them, so it's really not a long process. It's just a matter because it's done, programmatically. So it's the actual TMF report itself is not that long. A curriculum analysis does take a little bit longer because there's so much research that they have to do in terms of just mapping that curriculum to all the content you have, plus the other content that might fit well into that course. But a title matching report really is, it's a pretty quick turnaround. I don't have the exact date, exact amount of time, but I can definitely find that out.
Great, great. Looking at our questions, it looks like, and this may not be something, Barbara, that you can speak to, but we've got a comment sort of here from Margaret that says, we're members of Rapid ILL, which started with journal articles and then has book chapters and supports physical book lending. This person, Margaret, just is not clear about the sharing digital content, especially ProQuest resources through Rapid ILL. And I imagine that may be something you have to ask somebody about, Barbara.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah, so apologies, we're not able to dig into that too deeply at this point.
And actually, I am IMing with someone right now about the
right
TMF
now.
turnaround. So, and I'll also ask about the other question too.
Great. So while we're doing that, I would just encourage folks, if you have other questions, we have a few minutes here, so please feel free to drop them in. So we've got another question here from Christine that asks, will you be able to do this service using other languages? Is it limited to English, or and maybe we should ask for clarification on which service in particular Christine is asking about.
Yeah, I'm asking. I assume it's a TMF report. You're asking about whether we can match
the matching services. Yes.
Yeah, so it's matching on a number. So it's matching on an ISSN number or ISBN number. So it's probably going to spit out in English, but I would assume we could probably do a translation of that. And also I got an answer from the leader of that team, and he said a TMF report takes about 15 minutes.
So it just depends on how many they've got coming in.
Yeah,
sure.
So really, I mean, it could be, you could get it in a day or two, really. So it is just a matter of us getting your list of numbers. Sometimes that takes a little bit longer to pull all that together. And he did mention that, yes, the TMF report is in English only, but the reps can and do translate. Okay. Once that spits out in English, they'll go ahead and translate it into a different language.
Great. So I assume working or referring to that same report, we have a question here from Lily that asks about audiobooks. Are audiobooks included in the collections as well?
If they have an ISBN number, they technically they would be, because that's what we're matching on. But audiobooks you already have. So are you asking, like, would we replace a physical book with an audiobook? Is that as opposed to it like an ebook? Is that the question?
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure there. So if you have clarification, Lily, we'd be happy to take it.
Yeah, and I'll also ask that question since I have this guy on IM at the moment. Says.
And scrolling through the questions, if there are others that occur to you, please feel free to drop them in there. So Lily says yes, as replacements for
Yeah. So,
books.
yeah, so he's typing an answer to me now. So let's see what he says. Sorry for the delay. Okay. Okay, he said, books in general is a different type of TMF. Audiobooks aren't part of the TMF service, but they are in products for Alexander Street and O'Reilly. So product managers may be able to help out with a conversion from a physical book to an audiobook. So it's possible it's not part of the program, but we could look to see what of those books might be available as an audiobook that you have in physical form. So
Great.
Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, so it's something you could work with them on. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I'm learning a lot of stuff about books, TMF. So thanks for the questions.
Definitely. And I'll just give folks, a little more time if they do have questions to drop them in there. Because we do have a couple of minutes here, and I don't want to cut things short if there are additional questions. If you have anything for Jesse or for Barbara, we're happy to take those. But I would also mention that before you sign out today, you should sort of see a survey pop up on your browser after the session today. If you could take a minute just to give us a few responses. It's really only 5 or 6 questions. And if you could please let us know what you thought of the presentation today, and any other sort of feedback that you have. We're happy to have it, and we really value getting that from you. So if you could take a minute, we would really appreciate it. All right, and I'm not seeing additional questions come in, Barbara.
Okay.
I think we've gotten to all of them.
Okay.
So I will just take a second then to say thank you so much, Barbara and Jesse, for taking the time to present to us. Lots of interesting stuff there. Lots just converting from microfilm and moving stuff around. That's a big project, I know.
Absolutely. Yeah.
As a student worker, I helped with that at Virginia Tech at one point, so I have some.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to thank everyone too for joining us today, and thanks for all your questions. And I trying to get an answer on that rapid ILL thing, but we'll definitely get back to you on that. So hopefully it was informational and it was worth your time today. So we definitely appreciate the time that you gave us, and we look forward to seeing you in a future webinar. And I just want to thank Jesse as well for taking the time to share his story today. That's a huge project, and wish you well, Jesse, and seeing that through to the end. So thanks for joining us today as well.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, all of you out there, for joining us today. We'll hope to see you in the near future on another webinar. Thanks very much.
Take care.
You too.